Hi, my name is Sarah Christie, and I'm a senior English major at St. John Fisher College. I've lived in Rochester all my life, but up until about a month ago, I'd never been to Mount Hope Cemetery. Partly because no one I had known had ever been buried there, but mostly because I saw the Thriller music video as a 2-year-old and it really stuck with me. Luckily, I braved the trip and found that the cemetery really communicates more than I had been letting it. For those of you who are not from Rochester or who have never been to Mount Hope, here's a little background. The cemetery is located between what we now call Elmwood and Mount Hope Avenues. It's the nation's oldest municipal cemetery and was dedicated in October of 1838. It began as a relatively small plot of only 54 acres, but over the course of its existence is almost quadrupled in size, now over 2. The founders chose the current site because of what was then its distance from the heart of the city. Now, ironically, the cemetery lies pretty close to the heart of Rochester. The location was a topic of great debate among Rochester citizens, many of whom thought the landscape would be too hilly and would not be appropriate for burials. For the purposes of the late Victorian garden cemetery, though, the landscape was absolutely perfect. The cemetery began to draw a great deal of public attention. Residents treated the grounds more as a park, so it was decided that more attention should be paid to its appearance. The chapel that stands today just inside the main entrance is original, but changes were made to its crematorium smokestack to make it more pleasing to look at. That same year, an 18-foot-tall iron fountain was cast and placed in the circular drive. The highest elevation in Mount Hope is 675 feet, about 1.5 times as high as the street elevation downtown at 450, and just under the elevation of the city's highest point, Pinnacle Hill, at 750 feet. The grounds of Mount Hope, while picturesque, are in fact extremely hilly, due to Rochester's very distant geographical history. 12,000 years ago, New York State, and specifically Rochester, was covered in glacier. As the ice melted and receded, it scraped the earth and brought with it a great deal of rock and dirt. This rock and earth eventually settled, forming a solid ridge, otherwise known as an esker. The cemetery's main road, Indian Trail, followed this esker and was named for its original purpose. Before the cemetery was even in place, the Seneca Indians used it as a trail from Bristol Hills to Lake Ontario. Because it was, and essentially is a ridge, it allowed the tribe to stay up and out of the surrounding marshland, and to have a clear view of the valleys below. Today it serves a similar purpose, but for Mount Hope visitors instead. Stairs are very common at Mount Hope, because there's really no other way to navigate the hills and valleys, and trust me, I've tried and fallen. Most of the stairs are very rudimentary and obviously very old. They're just slabs of stone stacked and shoved into the ground. Some, however, are much newer and much nicer, made out of poured concrete or carved stone. In addition to eskers and hills, Mount Hope is also home to 4 kettles, round, naturally occurring pits in the earth that, in the case of Mount Hope, serve as spring and summertime ponds. Kettles are formed in much the same way as eskers, but in reverse. Instead of the retreating ice dragging rock upwards, the weight of a stagnant ice form compresses the ground below. Of course, I can't very well discuss a cemetery without talking about its grave sites and monuments. Nearly 400,000 people are interred at Mount Hope. Of these, most are buried, but the cemetery is also home to 75 mausoleums, some of which sleep entire families. The one pictured, for example, sleeps 10. Mausoleums and monuments like these certainly say something about the deceased's wealth, but I think that in some ways they say even more than that. Many of the people buried in Mount Hope were of great wealth, so presumably they bought these statues themselves and did not need to rely on their families. I think that this shows a great awareness of the aesthetic experience of visitors. While the majority of the cemetery's burials are individual or coupled, in some older cases, families would choose to purchase a group plot. This family, for example, the Reynolds, purchased a monument and the intricate stone surround, in addition to the plot wherein 20 of their relatives were buried. The Rows were yet another family that chose to be buried together in a family plot. Here you can see the family's mausoleum built into the side of the cemetery's esker, as well as several individual grave sites. Given the names, these people were presumably Charles Rowe's extended family and perhaps even friends. As such a large and moreover an old cemetery, keeping track of burials is close to a logistical nightmare for Mount Hope. Today, most of the past records have been digitized, and the office is able to locate plots in the cemetery's Find a Grave database. Here you can see a small stone grave marker from the time of the cemetery's founding, when records would have been kept in a logbook. The cemetery is home to many notable people. Rochester celebrities Frank Gannett, John Bouch, Henry Loam are all interred at Mount Hope, as well as nationally renowned figures like Frederick Douglass, Hiram Sibley, who urged the U.S. to purchase Alaska, Myron Holley, who instigated the creation of the Erie Canal, and Susan B. Anthony. But of course, as a municipal cemetery, burials were not and are not today limited by religion or class or race. This woman, for example, was a slave for Nathaniel Rochester's family, and as you can see, she's listed only by her presumed first name. Because she's defined in terms of the family for whom she worked, her identity ends up being contextualized by them. This grave is one of hundreds like it, with a nondescript, highly subjective engraving. Like the gravestones that read "My husband" or "Our darling Charlie," this stone honors someone's Lottie. In this way, the dead are identified in terms of their relatives and of whomever they belong to. And surely this was because the only visitors would be the deceased's family. Today, just as it has since its establishment, Mount Hope serves several purposes besides being a cemetery. Due in large part to its geography and its location, it's become a strange sort of communal space. Of course, people observe deaths here, but they also hike, jog, bike, picnic, and gather here for tours. Certainly, as a cemetery, Mount Hope ties together the past, present, and future, but unfortunately we tend to forget about the prior and focus more on the latter two. During Mount Hope's dedication ceremony, Reverend Pharcellus Church offered this address. In the highest sense in which a transfer can be made, Mount Hope by this act passes from the hand of the living to the hand of the dead. Let this place henceforth be visited to revive the memory of departed friends and to anticipate the exalted scenes of eternity. What's most interesting to me is that even now, nearly 2 centuries later, Mount Hope still does just that.